Hey, how's it going, man? Pretty good. Yeah, it should go away. Yeah. Um, if it doesn't, I guess just let me know. But usually in this room, when you first turn it on, there's a little bit of static, and then it starts working. Yeah. Exactly. I do the microphone.
You look anywhere and get a cup of coffee on this floor?
All the way on the. What's the best place to get a cup of coffee right now in this building?
In
That's
this, there's,
available.
I mean, you'd have to go all the way over to
New
the
cafeteria.
cafe,
The new cafe.
or in the first level of the Capitol. There's the other cafe.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right.
Sorry.
No problem.
We're in the same boat, though. So.
Okay, folks, it's 8 o'clock, and if we don't do anything else on this committee, we get started on time. Am I? No, I'm not going to take roll. That's what Noah's job to do. Couple little housekeeping items before we get started with Dr. Hartwig. In your folder, you'll see the subcommittees that you've been assigned to for House members. And I want to welcome the senators over here too who came to listen. So we've got several senators, and hopefully some more come in. And also we've got a little issue going on. You know, they got this little deal across the street on appropriations. Every 15 minutes the appropriation subcommittee changes for the amended budget. So it'll probably drop sometime this week. We've got several members on this committee who are also members of appropriations, so they'll be coming in and out. Plus, for those of you who haven't looked at the list, I think we have about 9 or 10 committee chairmen on this House committee. So we're blessed with some real talent on this committee. Couple of items. My administrative assistant, Pamela Lewis, sent out a little sheet for contact information. For those of you on the House committee, please give her the contact information that's requested, because otherwise something may come up and you may not know about it. So the email that you use, the phone that you answer to, please provide that information to her. Next item, we have 4 bills thus far that have been assigned to this committee. And I'm going to go ahead and assign those to the appropriate subcommittee chairs. And you'll see on the sheet who the subcommittee chairs are. Jeff Jones is Chairman, Administration and Licenses. Darlene Taylor has Health and Life, and Steve Tarvin has Property and Casualty. Then you'll see the members who are part of those various committees. House Bill 61 will be assigned to Property and Casualty. House Bill 84 will be to Health and Life, and House Bill 99 will be to Administration and Licensing. Administration and License is 99. All right, let's see. Now, something for those of you who like to eat. NAIFA, the National Association of Insurance and Financial Advisors, is having a reception at the law offices of Hall, Booth, and Smith, 191 Peachtree Street. That is today, between 5 and 7. And then tomorrow morning, NAIFA will have a breakfast at State Capitol, room 230, from 9 to 11. Most of us may be in session pretty shortly after. And then the Georgia Association of Health Underwriters will have an event this afternoon or today at lunch from, it begins at 11, lunch starts at 11:30 over in the Sloppy Floor room, the 20th floor, the Empire Room. So now, with the details out of the way, this meeting's gonna be a little different than what normal meetings are. This is an educational session. We do 1, maybe 2 of those a year. But this particular session has a little history to it, and we'll talk about that in a second. And I'm going to wait until next week. We'll meet again next week, and those of you who are on the insurance committee, you've received a packet on step therapy. That's Sharon Cooper's bill, and that's House Bill 63. It will be voted on next session, or presented next session. Glad John Carson just walked in. John is an integral part of what this program's about. Because Dr. Hartwig, when were you here last? Was it last year or? Last February. Yeah, last February. He presented a similar kind of program, and it was a real eye-opener, and even to the point that Representative Carson took that and got passed a hands-free driving bill. And for those of you who may not know it, he won a national award for that. So, did an outstanding job in making that presentation and doing that work to get that bill through. But Dr. Hartwig is here. He's the co-director of the Risk Management Center, University of South Carolina. And he's going to talk a little bit about an update on the automotive insurance trends after the hands-free Georgia Act. Plus, I think you're going to give us a little update on how premiums are set.
I will.
Okay, very good. Well, the floor is yours, Dr. Hartwig.
Well, thank you very much, and members of the committee and members of the Senate who've come and visited us today, and Representative Carson. Thank you very much. We've been in touch quite a few times over the past couple of years, really, on this particular issue. And actually, my appearances here even date back prior to last February, where I was bringing some fairly dire news to this and other committees about what was happening in terms of not only the number of claims and accidents and driving costs here in Georgia upward, but obviously that was contributing to what was really almost an epidemic in terms of the surge of fatalities on highways here in Georgia, which was really tragic. So what I'm going to do is give you an update on where the Georgia private passenger auto insurance market is today. And I'll be doing that by first taking a look at the major cost drivers here in Georgia. So we're going to look at the two major cost drivers, and those are the frequency of accidents and then the cost of accidents, in other words, known as the severity. And we'll look at kind of the pre and post hands-free Georgia Act period. And we'll also take take an update on the fatality rates here in Georgia as well. Talk a little bit about competition here in Georgia, including the rate-setting process, but how competitive Georgia's auto insurance market is compared to other states in this region and around the country, and how profitable it is relative to other states in this region and around the country. And then we'll talk a little bit, we'll recap with a summary and time for some Q&A. So, but also feel free to interrupt me at any time if you'd like a little elaboration. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but the Hands-Free Act was adopted on July 1st, I believe, of last year, correct? But there was a lot of, yes, enacted that day, but there had been a fair amount of discussion for quite some months prior to that. And so that's actually important to this because I think there was awareness about the hazards associated with distracted driving, thanks in large part to Representative Carson, and a lot of publicity by insurers and other groups around the country about the hazards. But when we think about what's driving auto insurance rates, it is the case that distracted driving is one part of it. It is thought today, it's estimated that distracted driving accounts for about 14% of accidents that involve injuries. Now, it'll involve an even higher proportion of accidents that don't involve injuries at all, including an 18-year-old who slammed into the back of my truck last year, not too long after I testified before this committee. But that's an entirely another story. He totaled his little Toyota thing. But at any rate, what I want to show you first are the frequency trends. In other words, what is happening to the frequency of accidents on Georgia highways for the various types of auto coverages that are commonly purchased in the state. So what we could see is some very severe frequency trends. In other words, these are data on a quarterly basis, and however they were annualized for each quarter. So what we can see is that basically if we go back to the end of 2014, early 2015, into 2015, and even 2016, we could see that each and every quarter that frequency trends for bodily injury claims. So in other words, the injuries for which you're liable as a driver of an at-fault vehicle were rising at a 5-6% annual clip each and every quarter. That began to improve a bit in terms of, it was moderating a bit as we got into the latter part of 2017. And as we moved into 2018, we have for the first time in years actual declines. Okay, this is a reversal. It's modest, but it is a reversal, and it's extremely important. But it is those years of very severe trends that really brought us to the point of seeing the need for the hands-free legislation that Representative Carson brought. So this means that injury accidents are being avoided now on the highways. That's great news. When we look at property damage liability frequency, again, those trends were fairly severe in 2015 and 16 in particular. They began to moderate as we got into 2017, and really, and these are the most recent data are available. We don't have fourth quarter 2018 yet. But what we could see is some pretty substantial declines here. So in other words, accidents that are producing property damage to other property, if you're an at-fault driver, property damage that you're responsible for. So this is good news as well. When we look at collision claims, so basically damage to your own vehicle, we could see that this is actually moving now in a negative direction after a couple of severe years where collision claim frequency was rising pretty sharply. So everything is moving in the right direction right now, and that's great news. Now, I can't paint a completely rosy picture because even though there are fewer accidents now on Georgia roads, say, than a year ago, at least in terms of the relative frequency, the cost of those accidents that are occurring, that remain, is still rising, typically speaking. And this is another trend. This has a lot to do with more expensive vehicles on the road. It used to be the case you could have a fender bender and it would cost $300 or $400 to fix. Now it costs $3,000 or $4,000 to fix because of all the sensors on vehicles and these kinds of things. So you continue to see bodily injury severity trends. So the injuries are actually continuing to cost more because there's a strong medical cost trend in Georgia and, quite frankly, in most parts of the country. The property damage, reflects the higher vehicle repair costs that you might be responsible for, or you might run into someone's house, something like this. These continue to rise even as the frequency falls. So that is the unfortunate reality of this, but at least the frequency is moving in the right direction. And again, when it comes to collision, we could see the collision severities are generally still up. Okay, so frequency is down, but severity is generally still up. So there's still some pressure in the system there. But what we could see overall is that if we look at some data that insurers are looking at, we could see that the loss ratio, basically the share of the premium dollar that's being paid out largely for the claim itself, is falling. So what we saw is that Georgia's loss ratio, which back in 2010 was far less than the U.S. overall for collision losses, actually got to the point where it was above the U.S. average by 2016 for the first time in recorded history as far as I could see. And finally now in 2018, for the first time since 2014, seems to be now slipping below the U.S. average. So that's really, really favorable, and that's being driven by these improved frequency trends across all the coverages. So that's fantastic news for drivers, for insurers, for everybody in the state. There are some other benefits here, and this is probably the most important one. Although we focused on costs, what we have seen is that there was a very sharp increase in fatalities on Georgia highways beginning in 2015, continued into 2016, where it roughly peaked there in 2016, was down very, very slightly, basically flat in 2017. But there was a 3.4% decrease in 2018. That's a beginning. Okay, so lives are being saved, and that's probably the most important thing that can be taken away from all of this, is that lives are beginning to be saved. And I would estimate that were we to have a 4% decline in 2019, which I don't think is unrealistic, that would result in an additional 60 lives being saved in 2019 relative to the fatality rate in 2018. So the improvements are slower than the deterioration, but at least we are moving in the right direction. And nationally, we're moving in the right direction too. But I actually think Georgia is poised to have an improvement in its fatal accident rate that is in excess of what we're seeing in the U.S. overall. So that would be good news. And I think certainly some part of that can be attributed to the Hands-Free Georgia Act. Now, a couple of other items. Where is Georgia in terms of its competitive profile for private passenger auto? Well, it is a very, very competitive market. There are 223 private passenger auto insurers competing for business in the state of Georgia. Most recent data is for 2017. They wrote about $8.6 billion in premiums on about 4 million vehicles. The number of vehicles on the road in Georgia is increasing fairly rapidly. That's an issue. Of course, you have issues like congestion and so forth that contribute to accident frequency. But it is a very large and vigorously competitive auto insurance market here in Georgia. There are numerous ways to look at this, objective ways to look at this, such as Department of Justice measures called a Herfindahl-Hirschman Index, and not to get too technical, but if you run this Department of Justice measure for concentration, which they usually look at in, say, antitrust cases, you find that there's no concentration in the, no significant concentration in the Georgia private passenger auto insurance market. So very, very competitive. And so by federal standards, Georgia's auto insurance market is very, very competitive. So it's not the case that there's any kind of lack of competition that could be contributing to rate pressure here in the state of Georgia. Now, I wanted to talk a little bit, and I've been asked to talk a little bit about how rates are approved here in the state of Georgia. We approve rates, or you approve rates, separately for the minimum limits, in other words, the legally required minimum limits to drive in the state of Georgia versus the amounts above that that are in place for most of the voluntary market. So this form of rate approval called prior approval, that is what is used for Georgia minimum limits. So this requires that the rates be filed and approved by the Department of Insurance before they can be used by the insurer. So currently the minimum limits in Georgia are 25, 50, 10, which means $25,000 per person for bodily injury, $50,000 per accident total for bodily injury, and $10,000 for property damage liability. These are very, very common limits found throughout the country. In terms of the voluntary market, if you will, for basically anything above those minimum limits, file and use is the law that is in place here, and that requires insurers to file rates with the State Department of Insurance. And those rates can be used immediately. And of course, at all times, regulators obviously retain the right to disapprove any rate that they find to be in violation of state law. But again, that's what's in place today pertaining to limits in excess of the minimum limits. There are variations on this that are used in other states, use and file. Insurers can implement rates immediately, but they're required to file the rates usually within somewhere in an interval of 15 to 60 days afterwards. And there are some other states that have no filing requirement at all. I believe Illinois is one of those states where insurers are not required to file the rates with the DOI, and of course the DOI can always request a schedule of those rates and the supporting data if they feel the need to review. So the review process is always there. Last thing, profitability analysis. Georgia has historically actually been a laggard in terms of profitability in the private passenger auto business. Things might be improving a little bit. Here you can see this is a return on net worth. In other words, an ROE, kind of like a return on equity measure for private passenger auto for Georgia in red and the U.S. overall auto insurance market in blue. And you can see that we're pretty much in sync for many years until around 2012, at which point Georgia's frequency and severity problems that we highlighted earlier really began to take off. Much more so than the rest of the country. So profitability in Georgia really suffered during this period, in fact, turned negative. But we saw some improvement in 2017 in Georgia and the U.S. overall. We do not have 2018 numbers yet, but I can assure you that both in the U.S. and Georgia, there has been some improvement. We won't have those data till later this year. And so there you can see it. Over the last 12 or so years, the average return on net worth for Georgia private passenger auto business was 2.9%, and for the U.S. overall, it was about 5.3%. So quite a significant difference, as you can see here. And 2017, last year, we have the data on the state level, 0.4% in Georgia, 3.7% for the U.S. overall. If I look at how Georgia stacks up to other states in the Southeast, it's a little bit hard to see, so I've highlighted it with red here. Let me just make sure they all come up. Hold on here a second. There we go. You can see the Georgia with the red circle around it is the lowest among neighboring states. I'm looking at South Carolina, Tennessee, Florida, and Alabama. And that has been the case really since about 2014, actually going back to 2012, actually, it's been the lowest in the region and again, lower than the U.S. Overall. So there's been some improvement, but Georgia still is lagging the pack in the Southeast. It is the case that I talked to you earlier about how the so-called loss ratio for collision coverage was falling. If we look at what's known as the combined ratio, meaning we take the losses, the expenses, and every other component that goes into what insurers pay out relative to what they pay in, we are seeing some improvements in private passenger auto business. We don't have these numbers at the state level for Georgia. Unfortunately, they're not tabulated in a way that corresponds to something we might want to present here. But nationally and in Georgia, these numbers are improving, okay? And again, this is largely the result of the improvement of the frequency trend. And if we look at how auto profitability nationally stacks up relative to the Fortune 500 group, you can actually see here that in the most recent data available that the private passenger auto businesses has not been wildly profitable for some period of time, about a 3.7% return on net worth relative to almost 14% for what's basically the Fortune 500 group overall. So a couple of, in conclusion here, the factors driving adverse loss trends historically in Georgia, we've had nationally and in Georgia a very sharp increase in miles driven. You see that in blue here. And for some reason on this screen, there is a white line, which isn't very helpful with a white background, but that is collision claim frequency. You can kind of see it streaking through the blue bar there. But what it does is it tracks this blue line very, very closely. So what it shows is there's a very, very strong correlation between miles driven and collision claim frequency. Not surprisingly, when people drive more, they're involved in more accidents, but they're involved in proportionately more accidents, in part because roads are more congested and so forth. And America is definitely driving more, and Georgia is definitely driving more, owing in large part to its very favorable demographics, which I put here in the summary, factors contributing to the sharp increase in death toll in Georgia's highways, which is only now being reversed. We had a recovering and a strong economy, meaning more jobs, more miles driven, increased vehicle density, very favorable demographics in this state, resulting in more drivers, lower gas prices, lack of highway infrastructure or sufficient highway infrastructure investment to address the congestion, more expensive vehicles, rising medical costs, and of course, this issue of distracted driving, which, as I showed in one of the very first slides, is a piece of this puzzle. And so there's no question in my mind that the Hands-Free Georgia Act is helping turn things around through increased awareness, and I would presume, especially as we move forward, enforcement. I think the word is getting out. In other states that have similar acts, they have seen benefits from banning effectively the use of these devices. But part of it is, again, it's an educational issue. This gets down into the high schools in particular, among college students, and that's where you can make the most impact. I'd be happy to address any questions anybody had. I'm sure the committee will be getting a copy of this presentation. And so if anybody has some questions, I'd be happy to answer those at this time.
Okay, does anyone have a question? Okay, what's your number down there? 27, okay, 27.
I had a question about fatalities from 2009 through 14. They seem to be a lot lower. Do you have any idea why those numbers were lower then?
Well, they were high and then they fell, and yeah, and they came down in part because there was less driving during the recession. So literally just fewer people with jobs, fewer people taking vacations, those kinds of things. That was part of it, and that was a national effect. However, as we kind of came out of the recession, we would expect to see more driving, more accidents, more fatalities, those sorts of things. But in Georgia, they accelerated far beyond what we saw around the rest of the country, and so that needed some explanation.
Is that it? Okay, number 5.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just had a question about the resources for hands-free driving, like the Bluetooth devices. I know that there were many individuals who came to the Capitol to testify and said, we'll avail you of resources, we'll help you, do partnerships. So what partnerships have you seen for helping people access these actual hands-free devices?
There's a long answer to this. I mean, part of it is that the technology of automobiles themselves is changing. So, in fact, many new automobiles themselves come equipped. For example, they're Bluetooth equipped. So you don't need any special equipment. You can take your ordinary cell phone, activate the Bluetooth, and operate hands-free the first day that you buy the vehicle. I'm not an expert in the technology, but I believe there are other technologies that allow you to sort of bridge this. But there are other technologies that allow you to talk simply without holding the phone. You see these all over the place, little earbuds, these kinds of things. So there's a lot of technology, and the cost of this technology is coming down, as does most technology. I should get some of my students in here. They'd be experts on these sorts of things. Because I think they're listening to something other than me in class sometimes. But I think that the technology of the future allows this, and the auto manufacturers have taken this on, in effect, as a challenge. They recognize that safety sells. People will pay for this technology in vehicles. Parents will pay for this technology in the vehicles that their children drive. And so I expect that as the average vehicle on the road is about 11 years old. So I think as we get most vehicles today are becoming equipped with this kind of capability. I think as we get about 5 years down the road, the majority of vehicles on the road in the United States will have this hands-free capability built into them.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Bruce, do you have a question? No, sir. Okay. All right. Well, I don't see any other questions. Appreciate the presentation. Appreciate more of the presentation earlier because it got John Carson to get our distracted driving bill passed.
Well, he's done a great job with that.
Finally got him moving out of the stationary position. But I really appreciate your presentation. You have presented some wonderful information, and he's right. I've got a hard copy of the presentation that I will distribute to all the House members, and I'll send one over to the Senate and let them do their thing too. Yes, 18.
Bob, thank you for being here. I was just curious, outside of Georgia, I've been asked to speak at various Senate and House committees in South Carolina.
Right.
I was there last week. Yeah, last week. A number of our border states and other states. Have you been giving a similar presentation to other states? Have you been invited? And if so, what has been the response?
I expect that to happen. I would say that I tend to evangelize usually within the insurance community itself, and for the support of such things. And so I would expect probably in a not too distant future to be talking to Director Farmer about he's actually spoken to me about this on a separate occasion. So
yeah, Ray and I have talked about this as well.
Yeah.
He's very, very supportive.
Yeah, and he's literally down the street from me. So
Right.
So I expect to be doing something in South Carolina before too long.
Based on your knowledge and expertise, you would be more likely to speak to the insurance company like you are here versus public safety, judiciary, non-civil, transportation, things like that. Is
Yeah,
that correct?
typically that's the case. That's the case,
And
yes.
these bills can end up in any one of those committees, or somewhat somewhere else.
Right, but I'd be certainly happy to make a similar presentation for any of these committees, yeah.
Thank you again,
Thank
Bob.
you, sir.
But when you do talk Director Farmer, remember he got his training here. So, all right, number 2.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Doctor, for your presentation.
Thank you.
I was curious, do you know what the percentage is of Georgians that utilize minimum coverage for their coverage?
I do not know that, and I don't know if anybody in the room, do you know that, Emily, off the top? We could research that and get back to you. It'll be a non-trivial number, I believe. I've seen it in other states. I've seen it nationally. So it's a non-trivial number, okay? So it's not 1 or 2%. I think it's substantially more than that.
And could you comment on how that might impact public costs or costs to the state?
In terms of those limits being inadequate?
Yes,
Are
sir.
you, there's minimum limits, and it's also possible for voluntary limits to be inadequate too. So that's part of the same question. Clearly, there's going to be a cost that's associated with individuals who are involved in accidents and where the liability that they are responsible for exceeds their limits. And those costs wind up being internalized in some other part of for instance, perhaps through the healthcare system, perhaps through the other individual's insurance. There's oftentimes more than one insurance policy at play. So overall, it does not change the net cost. It's just the costs simply get transferred. So the individual who has the minimum limits, in some sense, may not, the question is, where should the minimum limits be set? Okay, and I have looked at this, and minimum limits in Georgia are pretty much where they are in most other states, the 25, the 50, and the 10. So are there cases where there are accidents that exceed those minimums? Yes. Can I tell you exactly how many of those are? I cannot. Yeah.
If it would be possible to provide that data, certainly for the states that you've referenced today, I would really appreciate it.
Okay, I'll take a look at that.
Thanks.
Yeah, with the vehicles we're driving today, $25,000, it doesn't take long to get there. With, like you mentioned, with the sensors and cameras and all this stuff, even these little side
Right.
mirrors, you're looking at $1,200, $1,500 depending on the car.
Right. Of course, the implications of that, were you to have higher minimum limits, of course, that would raise costs.
Mm-hmm.
So the question is, who is buying the minimum limits? Are they people of limited means in terms of income? Obviously, we want to be aware of the fact that were the costs to go up as a result of minimum limits, you don't want people to fall out of the system. So I believe it's already the case that somewhere around 13% of drivers are driving around illegally without insurance today. So you want to be very, very careful about that. And that's an amazing number, that proportion of people are driving around without any insurance at all.
Okay, number 25.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do want to point out that the low limits that we're discussing here, just for maybe other members' knowledge, the 25, 50, 10 is referred to as split limits in Georgia. The 25,000 is for a single person in the other vehicle.
Correct.
You hit the other vehicle. There's a limit of $25,000 that will be paid for any single person in that vehicle's bodily injury. With an aggregate limit, if there's more than
Of
two passes, of
50,000, yeah.
50,000. But what I want to point out is the little 10 sitting there is the property damage for which you're liable if you happen to rear in one of these very expensive cars, and all of them are expensive now. If you damage a new car, you're only going to have $10,000 coverage. I would argue that it does drive up costs. I agree with you. It's going to ultimately get covered either through the not at fault parties' collision insurance or their uninsured, underinsured motorist coverage. But it is going to drive up system costs because it doubles the amount of work. The primary liability carrier has to get involved. then they hand it off to the not at fault insurance carrier, or they're working simultaneously. But more often than not, there's discussions by attorneys that get involved in it, and you can't forget the, and I'm sorry, I'm editorial, I'm not asking this informal
No, go
question,
ahead.
but is it not true then that the at-fault party in this case then has a judgment against them that drives down their credit score, it hurts them in the long run because of the fact that they have been at fault in an accident, they didn't have adequate, in this case, property damage insurance. So is that not true, that is an embedded cost that is driving up?
I mean, just as a general rule in the world of insurance, whether it's auto or whether it's home insurance, it doesn't matter what it is, business insurance, if you do not have sufficient limits, you're going to suffer the consequences as a result of that. And that's going to be the case whether you have minimum auto limits and you only have $10,000 in terms of property damage liability, or you have a $200,000 house and you only have $150,000 of coverage on it. I mean, you don't have a judgment against you, but you're going to come up short one way or the other, and there could be an economic burden that you've imposed on yourself. So, to the extent that people take minimum limits who can afford higher limits, they should certainly not be taking those minimum limits. But I think that oftentimes minimum limits are set the way they are because there's a feeling that there's an economic threshold here in terms of what people can afford.
Follow-up question, Mr. Chairman?
Yes, sir, go ahead.
So just to follow up to that, unlike homeowners insurance, which is oftentimes driven by the lenders, because the lenders are gonna make sure that you have adequate insurance, or even the physical damage insurance on cars, the collision coverage that the person paid, that's driven by lenders. But the vast majority of people that are purchasing minimum limit liability coverage are frankly, they don't have an expertise in insurance, and they're just trusting that they're buying what the state requires them to buy that should solve their problem if they have an accident. And more often than not, they don't understand at the time of the loss that they only have $10,000 coverage to fix the car that they son or daughter was texting and damaged the car in front of them. So this is my question. You mentioned in your presentation that we're sort of in the middle of the pack on our minimum liability, our minimum limits?
I would say your limits are consistent with the majority of other states. They are identical to or similar to what most other states require. So there are a few above and a few below. So the states tend to cluster right around what the limits are in Georgia, the 25, 50, 10. There might be a little bit of variation, particularly on the property damage side, but most states cluster right around there.
I guess my question would be, is there any evidence pointing to the fact that those states that are choosing to require slightly higher minimum limits are enjoying a more favorable loss trends because of the fact that claims are settled more quickly? And
that would have to be looked at. There aren't many with materially higher limits other than one or two stand out, like for some reason Alaska has much higher limits. I'm not sure that's really a comparable state. So I could look at that because I do have the data to be able to just simply look at the frequency trends for a couple of the coverages you're talking about, and do they vary notably from Georgia's, for example,
Thank you.
or other states with identical limits.
Thank you.
Number 15.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We do the 25, 50, and 25 as our minimum limits. And we have to keep in mind that because credit scoring is a part of the way premiums are determined in our state, poor people generally, in a lot of cases, have a credit score that is not favorable, which is then included in the type of rate that they get. So we have to balance what we need in the marketplace with what people can afford. And I would say to you that a good insurance agent is going to explain to people what the limits are and what it means to them and give them the option. But in many cases, people cannot afford the higher option. They know they need a higher option, but in many cases, they cannot afford the higher option. So also we have to think about the fact that if you have a minor accident and I just knock the mirror off your car, because there's cameras in that mirror that's on the side and all the gadgets, that is not a simple accident anymore. It costs a lot more to fix that than it did 10, 15 years ago when it was just a mirror. And you knock off a mirror, you get another mirror, keep going. So even small accidents, if you hit the rear fender, there's cameras back there. So you're not just replacing the bumper like you did several years ago. You got all these gadgets and equipment. So the cost of repairing vehicles have gone up because of the technology that's embedded in all of the things that we love.
And I think that's part of what's driving the trends I mentioned there, that while the frequency is beginning to fall, the severity or the average cost of a claim continues to rise.
Exactly.
And that's a phenomenon we're seeing across the country. There's just no question that, you know, cars are fast becoming, you know, computers on wheels.
Yes.
And computers are expensive to repair.
You finished?
I'm done.
Well, I don't see any more lights on. Really appreciate the presentation, and I think the questions and answers were equally as important because there's a lot of good information presented. Look forward to having you back in a year or two so we can get some more data to see how distracted driving has reduced our deaths more. Because I tell you, when I come up to the Capitol, right where Interstate 85 and 185 merge, there's this little sign up there.
That's right.
You know, and it says, you know, coming around November, December, when you see 1,600 fatalities, you know, all it takes is about 3 years and you can wipe out some counties.
That's right. It's 4 or 5 people a day in the
That's
state.
right.
So that's just too many. So so I think we're moving the needle in the right direction right now, albeit slowly, but it's moving in the right direction.
Yeah, but it's important. And, you know, I'm concerned that when you get on the interstate now, and, you know, and going 70 miles an hour, and most of us, I know very few people drive 70 miles an hour on the interstate. You may say you do, but I'd like to get behind you. But when you see people riding down the road in a truck, doing his steering wheel with his knees and sitting there texting, or you see somebody with a book laying on their steering wheel, and they're driving 70-something miles an hour on the interstate and going 70-something miles an hour, and you know it takes 10 seconds to do a text. How far do you go at 70 miles an hour and 10 texts? How many people can you kill or be killed in that distance? A bunch. So I'm a big proponent of this distracted driving solution that Representative Carson has done on his hands-free. I would like that there be a whole lot more enforcement. Now, I've got constituents. I had a lady call me the other day that I've known for years, probably longer than she wants to admit. And she was irate. She had a little Bluetooth thing in her ear, stopped at a stop sign or traffic light. It fell out of her ear, so she picked up her phone to see if it was still connected. Well, there happened to be a police officer sitting right next to her. And he wrote her a ticket because she had her hand. Now, the only time you have your hands, a phone in your hand is when you pull off the side of the road and your car's out of gear. You know, then you can do whatever you want to. But if you're in gear, you cannot have that phone in your hand. So it took a while to explain to her. And she had some other issues too that we got into. But you know, this is important, a very important issue. And you know, I heard somebody say one day, well, you know, I can drive as good talking on the phone with the phone up to my ears I can when it's not. Well, I don't want to be on the road with him. So, number 18.
Oh.
I just want to say one more time, Dr. Harwood, thank you for being here. And there's so many faces that I see on this committee, as well as particularly in the room here, that were so helpful about this. I really appreciate it. Now, Mr. Chairman, I want to say one thing. There was one person that helped behind the scenes quite a bit that I never mentioned to you, but former Chairman John Meadows. He was a insurance agent, as you know, and I shared this idea of, the study committee and distracted driving and combating this issue back at our caucus meeting in December of 2017, a while ago. And he said, "Carson, I hate cell phones," in his voice, and I said, "Well, what do you think about cell phones and driving?" He said, "That's the only thing I hate more than cell phones." Thanks, everyone.
Wow. That was Johnny. Yeah. You didn't have a hard time understanding where he stood on a particular issue. And that's all right. Well, Doctor, appreciate
Thank
it.
you.
Appreciate the presentation. I appreciate the committee making their comments and questions. Don't forget, next Wednesday, we will be looking at step therapy, and the House members have the folder. So y'all have a great day, and Doctor, I really appreciate it. Thank you, sir. Y'all,
Thank you,
meeting's
Mr.
adjourned.
Chairman.